The autumn mist clung to the rolling hills of northern England as Blackthorn Manor stirred awake beneath a pale October sky. Ivy crept along weathered stone walls, servants hurried through echoing corridors, and polished carriages rolled beneath the towering gatehouse. Within weeks, the estate would host one of the grandest weddings of the season. Society could speak of little else. The widowed Duke of Blackthorn, 45 years of age, had finally chosen a bride after nearly 7 lonely years. To the outside world, it seemed a perfect union. His fiancée was 27, graceful, accomplished, and admired in every drawing room from London to York. Her beauty was praised in newspapers, her manners celebrated by noble ladies, and her family delighted that such a prestigious title would soon belong to one of their own. Guests who visited the estate remarked upon how fortunate the Duke was to have found happiness again. Only the Duke himself could not silence the unease growing within him. He had spent years rebuilding his life after losing his beloved wife to illness. Her memory lingered in every corner of Blackthorn Manor, in the roses she had planted, the music she had played each evening, and the charities she had quietly supported without ever seeking recognition. Since her passing, countless noble families had presented eligible daughters, hoping to secure an alliance with one of England's wealthiest peers. He had politely refused them all until, persuaded by friends and mindful of his duty to the estate, he had accepted the hand of Lady Eleanor Ashcombe. Yet whenever she spoke of their future, her words seemed carefully polished rather than heartfelt. She admired the ballroom renovations more than the gardens. She discussed invitations more often than companionship. She praised the estate's grandeur, but rarely asked about the people who maintained it. Perhaps, he told himself, he was merely haunted by old grief. Still, doubt had a stubborn way of returning. One evening, while sharing brandy beside the library fire with his oldest friend, Sir Malcolm Harrington, the Duke confessed his uncertainty. "I cannot explain it," he admitted quietly. "She has never behaved improperly. Yet I cannot say I truly know the woman I am about to marry." Sir Malcolm studied the dancing flames before replying with a faint smile. "In great houses, Your Grace, people wear masks for those above them. If you wish to know someone's character, become someone they have no reason to impress." The suggestion was spoken lightly, but it settled heavily upon the Duke's thoughts. 3 days later, only the elderly butler, Mr. Whitmore, knew the truth as the Duke exchanged tailored coats for patchwork clothes. Gray powder dusted his dark hair, wire spectacles rested upon his nose, and rough gloves concealed hands accustomed to signing official documents rather than scrubbing floors. Bent slightly at the shoulders and carrying a worn broom, he appeared to be nothing more than a temporary janitor hired during the busy wedding preparations. No one looked twice at him. Guests passed him without greeting. Young footmen brushed by without noticing his face. Ladies lifted expensive skirts only to avoid the dust around his boots. The invisibility was startling. For the first time in decades, he wandered freely through his own home without anyone measuring every word he spoke. Late that afternoon, a modest carriage stopped beside the servants' entrance. A woman stepped down carrying neatly folded bundles of silk and lace. She wore a simple blue wool dress beneath a clean white apron, and though her clothing was plain, every stitch reflected careful craftsmanship. At 31, widow Margaret Ellis had earned a quiet reputation throughout the county as the finest seamstress in the district. Since losing her husband several years earlier, she supported herself and her 3 young children by sewing for both villagers and the local gentry. Balancing an armful of gowns, she noticed the disguised janitor struggling to lift a heavy crate of firewood. Without hesitation, she set her bundles aside. "Allow me to steady it," she said warmly. Together, they eased the crate onto the stone step. "You shouldn't strain yourself alone," she added with a gentle smile. "These old estates ask more of their workers than they ought." The Duke blinked in surprise. Most servants barely acknowledged him. Yet this woman, burdened with her own work, had stopped without being asked. As they walked toward the servants' hall, she poured the last of her warm tea into a tin cup and offered it to him. "You look chilled," she said. "Please take it. I can make more later." He accepted with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." She smiled again before gathering her fabrics and disappearing inside the manor. The Duke watched her go, strangely moved by such an ordinary kindness. If genuine character revealed itself in the smallest moments, then perhaps his disguise had already begun teaching him something no grand engagement dinner ever could. And as evening shadows settled over Blackthorn Manor, he decided that one day behind a broom would not be enough to uncover the truth hidden beneath the polished smiles preparing for his wedding. The following morning, Blackthorn Manor awakened to an air of hurried excitement. Florists carried baskets of late autumn roses through the entrance hall. Silverware gleamed beneath the hands of attentive footmen, and musicians rehearsed softly in the distant ballroom. Every corridor echoed with preparations for the engagement banquet that would welcome some of England's most distinguished guests. Hidden beneath worn clothes and carrying his broom, the Duke moved quietly among them, unnoticed once again. His disguise had already begun, revealing truths no formal conversation ever could. Servants spoke honestly when they believed no nobleman was listening. Some complained about aching feet or endless duties, while others spoke warmly of the Duke's generosity, recalling how he had increased wages after a harsh winter and paid medical expenses for injured workers. Hearing such stories humbled him. Respect earned through kindness, he realized, sounded very different from praise offered in polished drawing rooms. As he swept the marble corridor leading toward the West Wing, Margaret Ellis passed carrying several finished gowns protected beneath white linen covers. She paused when she noticed him rubbing his shoulder. "Still troubling you?" she asked with genuine concern. "It is only an old ache," he replied. She smiled kindly. Even old aches deserve a little rest. Without another word, she adjusted her pace to help him move a heavy bucket before continuing toward the ladies' dressing rooms. She expected nothing in return, not gratitude, not recognition, only the quiet satisfaction of easing another person's burden. The Duke found himself watching her disappear around the corner, wondering how someone carrying so many hardships could still possess such effortless compassion. Before long, voices drifted through the corridor ahead. Lady Eleanor and several fashionable companions had gathered inside the grand dressing chamber, while attendants arranged gowns and jewels for the evening celebration. Their laughter spilled through the slightly open door, sharp enough to cut through the silence. The Duke remained outside, pretending to polish the brass railing beside the entrance. "I confess," one young lady giggled, "your wedding has become the envy of London." "It should," Eleanor replied with amused confidence. "One does not refuse a dukedom." More laughter followed. Another voice asked playfully, "And are you deeply in love with His Grace?" The answer came without hesitation. "My dear, affection is delightful, but estates are considerably more useful." The Duke's hand froze around the polishing cloth. Inside the room, Eleanor continued speaking with casual amusement. "He is respectable enough, though dreadfully serious. Sometimes he speaks of tenant farmers longer than he speaks of music. Honestly, once I become Duchess, I shall see that the household concerns itself with elegance instead of endless charity." Her companions laughed again. "I suppose the old fool imagines I admire his noble heart," she continued. "In truth, Blackthorn Manor is the prize. A title opens every door worth entering." Each sentence struck harder than the last. The Duke had prepared himself to discover flaws, perhaps vanity or impatience, but not such cold calculation. The warmth she displayed in public had vanished completely. Here, among trusted friends, ambition replaced affection. One lady lowered her voice. "And what of the servants? They seem devoted to them." "They are sentimental creatures," Eleanor answered dismissively. "Half of them are too old to be useful. After the wedding, there will be changes. Efficiency before loyalty." At that moment Margaret entered quietly, carrying the final gown that required fitting. She immediately sensed the uncomfortable silence that followed. Eleanor glanced toward her with thinly veiled irritation. "There you are," she said. "Place it there." Margaret obeyed respectfully. One of the ladies nodded toward the departing seamstress and smirked. "She seems remarkably friendly with the servants." Eleanor laughed. "I noticed yesterday she was offering tea to that ridiculous old janitor. Some people simply cannot remember their place." The room filled with amused chuckles. Margaret stopped beside the doorway. "Kindness costs very little, my lady," she said gently, "whether one wears silk or work clothes." The laughter vanished. Eleanor's smile hardened. "I did not ask for a sermon from a seamstress." Margaret lowered her eyes, but did not retreat in embarrassment. "I only believe every honest worker deserves respect." Eleanor folded her arms. "Then perhaps you should practice your sewing instead of your opinions. I shall have someone else finish the alterations." The dismissal was immediate. Margaret quietly gathered her measuring ribbons without argument. She offered a respectful bow and walked from the room with calm dignity, though disappointment showed plainly in her eyes. As she passed the disguised Duke, she forced a faint smile, unwilling to burden even a stranger with her sorrow. The Duke remained motionless until her footsteps faded down the corridor. Everything he had heard echoed relentlessly through his mind. The woman he intended to marry had revealed herself not through scandal or betrayal, but through contempt for those she believed beneath her. In contrast, the humble seamstress had lost valuable work simply because she refused to abandon her principles. As the evening bells rang across the estate, the Duke looked toward the great ballroom where candles were already being lit for the celebration. The engagement banquet would proceed as planned, but deep within his heart, a quiet decision had already been made. He would not bind his future to a woman whose smile vanished whenever kindness was no longer required. The only question remaining was how much more truth still waited to be uncovered before he revealed his own. The engagement banquet ended beneath glittering chandeliers and polite applause, yet the Duke of Blackthorn remembered almost none of it. Every compliment offered by Lady Eleanor sounded rehearsed, every graceful smile carefully measured. Now that he had heard her true thoughts, each elegant gesture felt like part of a performance. He fulfilled his duties with flawless composure, but beneath the calm expression expected of a nobleman, disappointment settled heavily upon his heart. At dawn the following morning, he abandoned the disguise only long enough to summon his trusted butler, Mr. Whitmore. "I require absolute discretion," the Duke said quietly. "Before I make a decision that cannot be undone, I must know whether yesterday revealed an unfortunate moment or a lasting pattern." The elderly butler nodded. "I understand, Your Grace." Over the next several days, the Duke asked no spies to invent accusations and sought no rumors from jealous rivals. Instead, he quietly examined letters, household accounts, and records already within his authority. He also listened carefully to those who had served both families for many years. A troubling picture gradually emerged. Lady Eleanor's family had accumulated significant debts through extravagant living. Several merchants had waited months for payment despite repeated promises. More unsettling still, former servants who had once worked in the Ashcombe household described a mistress who valued appearances above fairness. Those who grew old or fell ill were dismissed with little compassion, while expensive entertainments continued without interruption. None of these discoveries amounted to criminal wrongdoing, yet together they confirmed what his own ears had already heard. Her ambitions centered not upon building a home beside him, but upon possessing everything his title could provide. The Duke spent an entire evening walking alone through the gardens his late wife had loved. She had once told him, "A marriage survives not because two people admire one another, but because they choose kindness when admiration fades." Those words now echoed with painful clarity. The following afternoon, formal letters were delivered to the Ashcombe residence. The engagement was ended. No accusations were written. No humiliating explanations were offered. The Duke merely stated that the marriage could not proceed because they were not suited in character, and he wished Lady Eleanor every happiness elsewhere. London society erupted with speculation before sunset. Some blamed the Duke's lingering grief. Others whispered that another noblewoman had captured his attention. Lady Eleanor publicly portrayed herself as a heartbroken victim, insisting she had never imagined such an unexpected betrayal. Her family expressed wounded dignity while privately mourning the loss of one of England's wealthiest matches. The Duke ignored every rumor. His conscience felt strangely lighter than it had in months. Yet one matter still troubled him. He could not forget Margaret Ellis leaving the dressing room with quiet dignity after losing valuable employment, simply because she had defended respect for ordinary people. Unable to dismiss the thought, he once again dressed as the elderly janitor and walked into the nearby village. Margaret's modest cottage stood beside a narrow lane where autumn leaves gathered against weathered stone walls. Through the window he saw her working beside a small table covered with fabric, while 3 children sat nearby. The eldest, a thoughtful girl of 10, carefully threaded needles. A lively boy of 8 polished worn school shoes until they almost looked new. The youngest, a cheerful 6-year-old girl, hummed softly while folding scraps of cloth into neat piles. Though their home contained little luxury, it overflowed with quiet cooperation. When Margaret opened the door and recognized the familiar old workman, genuine warmth brightened her face. "I feared you might have strained your shoulder again," she said. "Please come in. I've just made fresh vegetable broth." He accepted the invitation with sincere gratitude. The meal was simple: homemade bread, warm soup, and apples gathered from a neighboring orchard. But the conversation felt richer than any banquet he had attended in years. The children laughed easily, thanked their mother without being reminded, and welcomed a lonely visitor as though he had always belonged there. Only after the meal did Margaret mention the lost commission at Blackthorn Manor. "I shall manage," she said calmly while folding a length of wool. It was disappointing, certainly, but bitterness never stitched a single garment. The Duke looked at her with quiet admiration. "You do not resent the lady?" She paused before answering. "I pity anyone who believes rank excuses unkindness. Wealth may purchase comfort, but it cannot teach a gentle heart." Those simple words lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. As he prepared to leave, the youngest child hurried after him and pressed a freshly baked oat biscuit into his hand. "For your walk home," she said shyly. The Duke accepted it with unexpected emotion. He had spent years surrounded by magnificent dining tables, yet no expensive feast had ever felt as generous as that small biscuit freely offered by a child who possessed almost nothing. Walking back toward Blackthorn Manor beneath the fading afternoon light, he realized something remarkable had begun to change within him. He had first disguised himself to uncover deception, but instead he had discovered a family whose honesty made his own grand estate seem strangely empty. For the first time since ending his engagement, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow rather than dwelling upon yesterday, unaware that the greatest truth of all had yet to reveal itself. Over the weeks that followed, the Duke found more reasons to visit the village than even he could explain. Officially, he was still the elderly janitor who had completed temporary work at Blackthorn Manor. In truth, he had begun looking forward to the quiet evenings spent in Margaret Ellis's modest cottage, far more than the glittering invitations waiting upon his desk. There, conversation flowed without pretense. No one cared about noble titles or expensive estates. They spoke instead of honest labor, changing seasons, and hopes for the future. Margaret never questioned why the old workman visited so often. She simply welcomed him with the same warmth she showed every guest. Sometimes she asked him to hold a length of fabric while she measured it. Other times he helped her eldest daughter carry baskets of firewood or repaired a loose hinge on the garden gate. The children soon regarded him as a trusted friend, greeting him with cheerful smiles whenever they heard his familiar knock. One crisp November afternoon, the youngest girl tugged gently at his worn sleeve. "Do you have grandchildren?" she asked innocently. The Duke smiled sadly. "No," he replied. "Life did not grant me that blessing." The child slipped her tiny hand into his. "Then you may borrow us whenever you like." Her simple words touched a place in his heart that had remained empty since his wife's passing. He had inherited vast lands, ancient titles, and countless responsibilities, yet nothing had prepared him for the quiet joy of belonging at an ordinary family table. Meanwhile, gossip surrounding the broken engagement slowly faded from public conversation. Lady Eleanor withdrew from society for a time, hoping sympathy would restore her reputation, while the Duke devoted more attention to improving workers' cottages and expanding charitable efforts across his estate. His decisions reflected not duty alone, but lessons learned from watching Margaret live with dignity despite hardship. At last he realized he could no longer continue the deception. One evening he arrived at the cottage dressed not as the janitor, but as the Duke of Blackthorn himself. His tailored coat, polished boots, and family signet ring left no room for misunderstanding. Margaret opened the door, looked into his face, and stood perfectly still. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. "I know you," she whispered at last. He removed his hat slowly. "Yes," he answered, "and I owe you an apology." Confusion, surprise, and hurt crossed her face all at once. "You were the janitor." "I was." "You heard everything at the manor." "I did." "And you trusted me enough to return?" "I trusted you from the moment you shared your tea with a stranger." Margaret stepped aside silently, inviting him inside. The children sensed the unusual seriousness and quietly left the room after offering respectful bows. The Duke told her everything, from the doubts that had haunted him before the engagement to Sir Malcolm's unusual advice and the disguise that had allowed him to discover the truth. He admitted his shame at deceiving an innocent woman, though his purpose had never been to mock her. When he finished, silence settled over the cottage. Finally Margaret spoke. "I should be angry. You have every right. But when I think of the man who carried firewood, mended my gate, and listened patiently to my children, I cannot separate him from the Duke sitting before me." He lowered his eyes. "I feared my title would change the way you saw me." She smiled gently. "It changes your responsibilities, not your character." Those quiet words lifted a burden he had carried for years. Over the following months, he no longer hid behind false appearances. He visited openly, though never with lavish gifts or displays of wealth. Instead, he brought books for the children, seedlings for the garden, and fresh bread from the estate bakery. He listened more than he spoke, discovering that affection grew strongest through ordinary moments shared honestly. As winter surrendered to spring, the Duke invited Margaret and her children to walk through the blooming gardens of Blackthorn Manor. Beneath an ancient oak overlooking the valley, he stopped beside the very rose beds his late wife had once tended. "I once believed I needed a Duchess to complete this house," he said quietly. "Now I understand the house has only been waiting for the right heart." From his pocket, he drew a small velvet box containing a simple sapphire ring. "Margaret Ellis," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "will you honor me by becoming my wife?" Tears gathered in her eyes before she answered, "Only if we build our home with the same kindness that first brought us together." The Duke smiled with a peace he had not known in many years. As church bells echoed across the distant countryside, he realized that disguising himself as the lowest servant had not merely saved him from a loveless marriage. It had led him to the one woman who had seen worth in a stranger before she ever knew he wore a crown. Their wedding day now awaited them, promising not the grandest union England had ever witnessed, but perhaps the truest.